Module 4, Knowing what is good fashion drawing and sketching, appreciating good fashion illustrations, knowledge input with respect to professional illustrators and illustrations, appreciation of good fashion illustrators and illustrations. Fashion illustration has been around for nearly 500 years, ever since clothes have been in existence. Fashion drawings and sketches can be found in many parts of the world if they can be considered as fashion illustrations. There has been a need to translate an idea or image into a fashion illustration. Not only do fashion illustrations show a representation or design of a garment, but they also serve as a form of art. Fashion illustration shows the presence of hand and is said to be a visual luxury. There was a decline of fashion illustration in the late 1930s when Vogue began to replace its celebrated illustrated covers with photographic images. This was a major turning point in the fashion industry. Laird Borelli, author of Fashion Illustration, at that point of time stated, "Fashion illustration has gone from being one of the sole means of fashion communication to having a very minor role. The first photographic cover of Vogue was a watershed in the history of fashion illustration and a watershed mark of its decline. Photographs, no matter how altered or retouched, will always have some association with reality, and by association, truth. I like to think of them, fashion illustrations, as prose poems and having more fictional narratives. They are more obviously filtered through an individual vision than photos. Illustration lives on, but in the position of a poor relative to the fashion world." Hidden in this statement is the fact that fashion illustrators can do wonders with their creative talents and skills. A large number of designs, patterns, textures, colors, shapes, or forms can be visualized and illustrated, unlike photography, which requires the real subject to suit today's ever-changing needs. Therein lies the strength of the fashion illustrator. A number of companies all over the world deal with illustration of hats to all the essential fashion items using classical art techniques and unique materials to suit the particular fashion illustration requirements. In the late 16th century, the costumes from all around the world were regarded as fashion illustration by the Europeans. In the 17th century, the French and German magazines published the work of many designers. The print media increased the popularity of the fashion illustration in the 18th century. The fame reached up to the ordinary man and possessed social aspirations. The era of the 19th century was a very significant era for fashion illustration, as artists like Charles Dana Gibson and Paul Poiret took fashion illustration to a new dimension. The advancement in the field of photography changed the working manner of the fashion illustrators. Many designers hire fashion illustrators to assist them for designing clothes and to gather the attention of the potential buyers. An effective illustration of the clothes is very helpful in portraying the image of the attire better than a photograph. Moreover, the fashion illustrators have very significant position in the eyes of the designers, as their drawings enable the designers to determine the direction of their work and make their collection appear more unified. Fashion illustration has become a wider field nowadays. It is divided into three distinctive categories. The sensualist depicts the work with the traditional form of processes and the materials. The technocrats employ the digital means of creating the images, and the gamins and sophisticates are playful in their work, which reflects the whimsical reference of the traditional forms of the fashion illustrations. Europe has established itself as the continent of fashion historically. It is in Europe that fashion evolved, and many of the most renowned fashion houses that we know as household names today started in the early years of the last century in the fashion capitals of Europe. It is in Europe that haute couture still has its home, and where the top designers meet every year to show their creations and celebrate the festival of high fashion. Over the years, Italy has established its prestigious role in the fashion field, appointing Milan as the capital city of fashion. The first Italian designer boutiques, in fact, were opened in Milan, and the most famous designers usually present their new collections in Milan. We can certainly affirm that Italian fashion has always been linked to the city of Milan, and this beautiful city is still today the symbol of style and elegance, the favorite destination of all those fashionistas looking for the best in the matter of trends and style. At this point, you might easily assume that fashion was really born in Milan many years ago, that the first fashion designer was an Italian, and that Italy has always been the undisputed leader of fashion all around the world. Italy, and in particular Milan, has certainly given a valuable contribution to the development of fashion trends and styles in the world, but it can't take the credit for having given birth to the very first fashion designer. This honor has to go to France, and in particular to Paris, where fashion took its first steps thanks to the skills of Marie Antoinette's personal court designer Rose Bertin at the end of the 18th century. We will now move on to explore the beginnings of couture fashion. Rose Bertin, 1747 to 1813, was the dressmaker to Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, and a figure who may be said to have begun the transition from relatively little known dressmakers to designers with a high public profile, sometimes called sarcastically the Minister of Fashion. She opened a shop in Paris and had a considerable influence on Parisian style. Rose was not a designer to start with, but just a fabric seller who attended the French court to offer her products for the making of the legendary queen's dresses. She soon became Marie Antoinette's lady in waiting, and with the passing of time, she started taking charge of the queen's look and styling. In fact, Marie Antoinette was very young when she married Louis XVI and had to move from Vienna to Paris. She was not used to paying much attention to her look and at first did not look like a royal princess. Her mother, the Queen of Austria, Maria Theresa, often wrote her letters suggesting that she pay attention to her dress, her hair, and her physical look to establish her image as a powerful woman. Given that she would one day be the new Queen of France, Rose was not a designer to start with, but just a fabric seller who attended the French court to offer her products for the making of the legendary queen's dresses. The French Revolution drastically changed all these. Rose Bertin went into exile in London for some years because of the French Revolution. Her individual fashion sense was given expression when, among her ladies in waiting, Marie Antoinette noticed the skillful fabric seller Rose Bertin, who immediately became her personal dressmaker and stylist. Rose totally adapted Marie Antoinette's look, creating a special relationship with her. Marie Antoinette was probably the first top model, dressing in Rose's creations and trying them out like a professional model. The first fashion parades took place at the spectacular Galerie des Glaces of Versailles among ambitious ladies in waiting, the king's lovers, parties, and love intrigues. At those special occasions, Queen Marie Antoinette and the women of her court could show off the beautiful creations of Madame Rose Bertin and display her talent for fashion and elegance, immortalizing her as the first official fashion designer. A significant shift in culture occurred in France and elsewhere at the beginning of the 18th century, known as the Enlightenment, which valued reason over authority. In France, the sphere of influence for art, culture, and fashion shifted from Versailles to Paris, where the educated bourgeois class gained influence and power in salons and cafes. The new fashions introduced therefore had a greater impact on society, affecting not only royalty and aristocrats but also middle and even lower classes. Ironically, the single most important figure to establish Rococo fashions was Louis XV's mistress, Madame Pompadour. She adored pastel colors and the light, happy style which came to be known as Rococo. Subsequently, light stripe and floral patterns became popular. Towards the end of the period, Marie Antoinette became the leader of French fashion, as did her dressmaker Rose Bertin. Extreme extravagance was her trademark, and this ended up by majorly fanning the flames of the French Revolution. Fashion designers gained even more influence during this era, as people scrambled to be clothed in the latest styles. Fashion magazines emerged during this era, originally aimed at intelligent readers, but quickly capturing the attention of lower classes with their colorful illustrations and up-to-date fashion news. Even though the fashion industry was ruined temporarily in France during the Revolution, it flourished in other European countries, especially England. During this period, a new silhouette for women was developing. Panniers or wide hoops worn under the skirt that extended sideways became a staple. Extremely wide panniers were worn to formal occasions, while smaller ones were worn in everyday settings. Corsets provided contrast to the wide skirts, tightly constricted waists, plunging necklines also became common. Skirts usually opened at the front, displaying an underskirt or petticoat. There were a few main types of dresses worn during this period. Pagoda sleeves arose about halfway through the 18th century, which were tight from shoulder to elbow and ended with flared lace and ribbons. The vaccio gown had a loose back which became part of the full skirt and a tight bodice. The robia la franais also had a tight bodice with a low-cut square neckline, usually with large ribbon bows down the front, wide panniers, and was lavishly trimmed with all manner of lace, ribbon, and flowers. The robe, a langlois, featured a snug bodice with a full skirt worn without panniers, usually cut a bit longer in the back to form a small train, and often some type of lace kerchief was worn around the neckline. These gowns were often worn with short, wide lapelled jackets modelled after men's redingotes. Mary Antoinette introduced the chemise, a la reine, a loose white gown with a colorful silk sash around the waist. This was considered shocking for women at first, as no corset was worn and the natural figure was apparent. However, women seized upon this style, using it as a symbol of their increased liberation. Women's heels became much daintier with slimmer heels and pretty decorations. At the beginning of the period, women wore their hair tied to the head, sometimes powdered or topped with lace kerchiefs, a stark contrast to their wide panniers. However, hair progressively was worn higher and higher until wigs were required. These towering tresses were elaborately curled and adorned with feathers, flowers, miniature sculptures, and figures. Hair was powdered with wheat meal and flour, which caused outrage among lower classes as the price of bread became dangerously high. Men generally wore different variations of the habita la franais, a coat, waistcoat, and breeches. The waistcoat was the most decorative piece, usually lavishly embroidered or displaying patterned fabrics. Lace jabots were still worn tied around the neck. Breeches usually stopped at the knee, with white stockings worn underneath and heeled shoes, which usually had large square buckles. Coats were worn closer to the body and were not as skirt-like as during the Baroque era. They were also worn more open to showcase the elaborate waistcoats. Tricon hats became popular during this period, often edged with braid and decorated with ostrich feathers. Wigs were usually worn by men, preferably white. The Cadogan style of men's hair developed and became popular during the period, with horizontal rolls of hair over the ears. French elites and aristocrats wore particularly lavish clothing and were often referred to as macaronis. The lower class loathed their open show of wealth when they themselves dressed in little more than rags. Fashion played a large role in the French Revolution. Revolutionaries characterized themselves by patriotically wearing the tricolour red, white, and blue on rosettes, skirts, and breeches. Since most of the rebellion was accomplished by the lower class, they called themselves sans culottes or without breeches, as they wore ankle length trousers of the working class. This caused knee breeches to become extremely unpopular and even dangerous to wear in France. Clothing became a matter of life or death. Riots and murders could be caused simply because someone was not wearing a tricolour rosette, and people wearing extravagant gowns or suits were accused of being aristocrats. The Rococo era was defined by seemingly contrasting aspects: extravagance and a quest for simplicity, light colors and heavy materials, aristocrats and the bourgeois. This culmination produced a very diverse era in fashion like none ever before, although this movement largely ended with the French Revolution. Its ideas and main aspects strongly affected future fashions for decades. The history of fashion design refers to the development of the fashion industry, which designs clothing and accessories. The modern industry, based around firms or fashion houses run by individual designers, started in the 19th century. Charles Frederick Worth was the first designer to have his label sewn into the garments that he created. He is also usually seen as the first designer in something like the modern sense, with a large business employing many largely anonymous tailors and seamstresses. A former draper, Worth's success was such that he was able to dictate to his customers what they should wear. Throughout the early 20th century, practically all high fashion originated in Paris and to a lesser extent in London. Fashion magazines from other countries sent editors to the Paris fashion shows. Department stores sent buyers to the Paris shows, where they purchased garments to copy and openly stole the style lines and trim details of others. Both made to measure salons and ready to wear departments featured the latest Paris trends, adapted to the store's assumptions about the lifestyles and pocketbooks of their targeted customers. At this time in fashion history, the division between haute couture and ready to wear was not sharply defined. The two separate modes of production were still far from being competitors, and they often coexisted in houses where the seamstresses moved freely between made to measure and ready made. Around the start of the 20th century, fashion style magazines began to include photographs and became even more influential than in the future. In cities throughout the world, these magazines were greatly sought after and had a profound effect on public taste. Talented illustrators, among them Paul Irebe, Georges Lepape, Ert, and George Barbier, drew attractive fashion plates for these publications, which covered the most recent developments in fashion and beauty. Perhaps the most famous of these magazines was La Gazette du Bon Ton, which was founded in 1912 by Lucien Vogel and regularly published until 1925. At this juncture, it would be very useful for students to know and understand about some of the famous fashion illustrators. It is the person, talent, skill, and the times that define fashion illustration. One must be well versed, practiced, and bold enough to make use of the technologies and mediums of their own times and locations. One should not hesitate to make use of the old and tested mediums and techniques, or to experiment with new and offbeat materials and techniques wherever required. Andy Warhol was an American artist who was a leading figure in the visual art movement known as pop art. His works explore the relationship between artistic expression, celebrity culture, and advertisement that flourished by the 1960s. After a successful career as a commercial illustrator, Warhol became a renowned and sometimes controversial artist. The Andy Warhol Museum in his native city, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, holds an extensive permanent collection of art and archives. It is the largest museum in the United States dedicated to a single artist. It would be very difficult to state the contribution of Andy Warhol to the fashion industry. We did rather try to understand the kind of impact he created in the industry, how much of influence he has had on fellow illustrators, and overall what the fashion industry has gained through Andy Warhol. A pivotal event was the 1964 exhibit, The American Supermarket, a show held in Paul Bianchini's Upper East Side Gallery. The show was presented as a typical US small supermarket environment, except that everything in it, from the produce, canned goods, meat, posters on the wall, etc., was created by 6 prominent pop artists of the time. Warhol's painting of a can of Campbell's soup cost $1,500, while each autographed can sold for $6. Warhol's work, both as a commercial artist and later a fine artist, displays a casual approach to image making, in which chance plays a role and mistakes and unintentional marks are tolerated. During the 1950s, Warhol gained fame for his whimsical ink drawings of shoe advertisements. These were done in a loose, blotted ink style and figured in some of his earliest showings at the Baudelaire Gallery in New York. Warhol started his career as a commercial illustrator, producing drawings in blotted ink style for advertisements and magazine articles. Best known of these early works are his drawings of shoes. These pictures were found in a book titled Andy Warhol Fashion Forward by Simon Doonan. The book is a gorgeous gallery of whimsical fashion illustrations by Andy when he worked as an advertising illustrator and commercial artist. If you want to see more, you can pick up Andy Warhol Fashion, a book that has gathered up a sampling of his work in a nice little paperback. By the early 1960s, however, pop art and new ultra-modern styles became popular as the counterculture became mainstream. Pop art inspired illustrations became the norm, with more whimsical and abstract illustrations as well, rich with color. The most notable fashion illustrator is much better known for his pop art, but long before his Campbell's soup can print was created, he was known in the 1950s as a shoe illustrator, mainly for magazine advertisements. His style was loose and abstract. From the 1960s through 70s, the pop art style, largely influenced by Warhol, of course, was highly influential in fashion illustration. Other fashion illustration, however, remained similar in style to that of the 1950s. Warhol once said that all one needs to know about his work is already there on the surface. At the height of his fame as a painter, Warhol had several assistants who produced his silk screen multiples, following his directions to make different versions and variations. American pop artist Andy Warhol's glory days were the 1960s. Warhol was firmly ensconced in the New York art scene and had a decade of exhibitions and acclaim under his belt. This is a fashion illustration done by Andy Warhol before he was known for his Marilyn Monroe and Campbell soup can. He started off doing commission pieces for magazines in New York. This was obviously commissioned for a fashion magazine. He was very well known for his beautiful pen and ink drawings and shoe advertisements. I believe that this piece was successful for the time. Since the audience for these fashion magazines was geared towards fashionable women, he is showing a beautiful young woman dressed in an outfit that would suggest for an upper class person. When Alexei Brondovich was art directing Harper's Bazaar, he ran a striking cover by Herbert Bayer for its 1940 College Fashions issue. A three-quarter view photo of a woman's face is duplicated in 2 rows of 4, a clear newsstand eye-catcher. In his formative years as a commercial artist, Warhol would regularly produce drawings by tracing photos. Although the article doesn't mention bazaar, it does remark that the sketch reflects his obsession with repetition. And now it's safe to say that in its own way, this cover may be as relevant to his aesthetic as the Niagara publicity still he appropriated for his Merlin series. In the 50s, photography was the dominant medium used to advertise food and household goods. However, the fashion industry preferred the stylized and interpretive use of illustrations which provided qualities of boldness, flatness, and a sharp delineation of forms that became a trademark of Warhol's line drawings during this period. Warhol's success in the advertising industry is attributed to both his mastery of the medium and his legendary work ethic and willingness to cooperate with art direction, providing editors with numerous variations to choose from. Even more noteworthy are the several other associations between the magazine cover and specifically the 1962 Marlin diptych, one of Warhol's most famous and influential artworks. For example, each of the Bayer's faces is at a different distance from the next. The shift is subtle, like the slight tonal variations on the faces, but apparent enough to indicate the hand of the designer rather than mere mechanical repetition. Flamboyant fashion illustrator Antonio Lopez started his career in the 1960s. His illustrations are a fabulous product of their time, absorbing pop culture and high art alike, creating something unique and trend-setting. His work appeared in such publications as Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, LE, Interview, and the New York Times. Several books collecting his illustrations have been published. In his obituary, the New York Times called him a major fashion illustrator. He generally signed his works as Antonio. His work continues to be popular today, with fashion designers Hannah McGibbon and Marc Jacobs citing Antonio Lopez as their source of inspiration. Antonio Lopez was born in Utuado, Puerto Rico. When he was 7 years old, his family moved to New York City. His parents, Maria Luisa Cruz and Francisco Lopez, influenced him to apply his artistic talents to fashion. He attended the High School of Art and Design and the Fashion Institute of Technology. While attending the FIT, he began an internship at Women's Wear Daily, which led to him leaving school and working at the publication. Shortly afterward, he left for a position at the New York Times. Lopez worked in close collaboration with Juan Eugene Ramos. He also did illustrations of fashion designs by Charles James. In 1969, he moved to Paris along with Ramos and was an associate of Karl Lagerfeld. He stayed there until the mid 1970s. Antonio discovered Jessica Lange in 1974. He discovered Jerry Hall and lived with her in Paris at the beginning of her modeling career. Lopez and Ramos also discovered Grace Jones and Tina Chow. In addition to books of his fashion illustration, the book Antonio's Tales from the 1001 Nights was published in 1985. The book was inspiration for Marc Jacobs' 2007 Arabian Nights event, a book on the career of Antonio Lopez, Fashion, Art, Sex and Disco by Roger Padilha and Mauricio Padilha, with a foreword by Ander Leon Talley and an epilogue by Anna Sui, was published by Rizzoli in September 2012. His circle of friends also included the photographer Bill Cunningham. 1966, Antonio introduced him to photographer David Montgomery, who gave Cunningham his first camera. Lopez died of Kaposi sarcoma as a complication of AIDS at UCLA Medical Center. He was living in New York but was in Los Angeles for an exhibition of his art. He was attended by his friend and model Susan Baraz. His collaborator Juan Eugene Ramos survived until 1995, when he also died of AIDS. Lopez explored themes of pure desire and race in his art through cultural references to subjects such as Josephine Baker and the Wild One. Painter Paul Karancikas is president of the Antonio Lopez Foundation. The organization focuses on AIDS, which raises funds for AIDS research, care and education through photography auctions, was founded in 1987 by Baraz and View magazine publisher Hossein Farmani. In response to Lopez's death, Lopez's art and photography were exhibited at Staley Weiss Gallery in New York in March-April 2000. Designer Hannah McGibbon cited Lopez as an inspiration for her fall 2009 ready-to-wear collection for Chloe. Lopez's work was included in April 2009 exhibit The Line of Fashion, curated by Robert Richards at the Society of Illustrators in association with the Leslie Lohman Gay Art Foundation. Antonia's Tales from the 1001 Nights was an inspiration to fashion designer Suneet Verma's 2010 collection, The Pirates of Couture. His work is also included in the exhibit Drawing Fashion at the Design Museum in London, England, running November 17, 2010 to March 6, 2011. Students at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City request his name at the library more than any other. Christian Berard, also known as Bebe, was a French artist, fashion illustrator and designer. He was born in Paris, France in 1902. As a child, he was fascinated by the theatre and ballet and compiled albums of costume and scenery designs. He attended the Académie Ranson from 1920 to 1923. Although painting was his first love, he concentrated during the 1930s on fabric and interior design, as well as book and fashion illustration. His work appeared in Harper's Bazaar and Vogue, who published a great many of his drawings from 1935 until his death in 1949. He illustrated most of the leading designers of the time, including Vionnet, Revillon, Schiafarelli and Jean Patou. Berard and his lover Boris Kochnow, who worked for the ballets Russes and was also co-founder of the Ballet des Champs-Élysées were one of the most prominent openly homosexual couples in French theatre during the 1930s and 40s. Berard was born in Paris and studied at the Lycée Janson de Sailly as a child. In 1920, he entered the Académie Ranson, where his style was influenced by Edouard Vuillard and Maurice Denis. Berard showed his first exhibition in 1925 at the Galerie Pierre. From the start of his career, he had an interest in theatrical scenery and costume designs and played an important role in the development of theatrical design in the 1930s and 1940s. In the early 30s, Berard worked with Jean-Michel Frank painting screens, woodwork, and drawing projects for carpets. He also worked as a fashion illustrator for Coco Chanel, Elsa Schiaparelli, and Nina Ricci. Berard's most renowned achievement was probably his lustrous, magical designs for Jean Cocteau's film La Belle et la Bête in 1946. He was one of the great bohemian characters of Paris. Whilst only in his early 30s, he became the darling of salon, theatre, and cafe alike, a central figure of the artistic demi-monde. Aged only 47, Christian Berard died suddenly from a heart attack on 11 February 1949, whilst at work on the costumes and sets for Les Fourberies des Scapin at the Theatre Marigny. Berard's work is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, New York, and the Menil Collection, Houston. Francis Poulenc's Stabat Mater 1950 was composed in his memory, and Jean Cocteau dedicated his film Orphée 1950 to him. Dagmar Freuchen-Gale was a Danish illustrator, author, and editor. She was known for her fashion illustrations for Vogue and Harper magazines. Her spouses were Müller, Peter Freuchen, and Henry Gale. Dagmar was born in Kongens Lyngby, Denmark. She left Lyngby in 1938 to come to New York. Dagmar married 3 times. First to a Danish man named Müller, who was killed during World War II while serving in the Pacific with the American Army. She met her second husband, Peter Freuchen, 1886 to 1957, December 24, 1944, in New York at a home of some friends they had in common from Denmark. They married in 1945. Peter was a Danish author and Arctic explorer. Beginning in 1945, they lived in New York City and maintained a second home in Nyack, Connecticut on Chesbrough Street, overlooking Long Island Sound. They appeared together in a well-known photo by Irving Penn showing Peter with a beard in a massive fur coat. Peter often traveled for his work during their marriage, but is reported to have returned home every day and sent a copy of each correspondence to the Danish Royal Library, to be opened 50 years after his death in 2007. Dagmar joined Peter only once in his travels on an expedition to Iceland, during which she served native meals including pickled whale blubber and seaweed. During their marriage, she became an expert on various cuisines from around the world. After Peter's death, Dagmar maintained the Nyack home until 1963. Her third marriage was in 1967 to Henry Gale, an attorney from New York. She returned to live in Denmark in the early 1970s. In April 1947, Dagmar illustrated the cover of Vogue, which presented Christian Dior new house with new vigor, new ideas. Here makes a variation of his market woman skirt, stiffened, standout, pleated at a low mark. The hat is by Maud roser, white pick banded with navy blue chiffon. She also taught fashion illustration starting near the end of the 1940s at the Art Students League and continuing there for 20 years. She edited several of her second husband's books in addition to being an illustrator and teacher. She was a cook who prepared exotic dishes. Dagmar wrote a cookbook titled Cookbook of the Seven Seas. Irvin Crosthwaite was a Canadian painter best known for his role as a fashion illustrator. Born in Creston, British Columbia, he was the official Canadian World War II naval artist. Crosthwaite first began his studies as an artist in Montreal at the Sir George Williams College, where he studied for 3 years. This was soon followed by a year at the Pratt Institute. 1944, Crosthwaite was awarded the prestigious Canadian Jessie Dove Prize for his watercolor painting. It also was during this time in which he was attached as an artist to the Royal Canadian Navy during the Second World War. In 1946, Crosthwaite set up a studio in Paris. It would take 12 more years, but it would be in Paris where he would establish himself as a fashion illustrator. Crosthwaite soon found success and was soon under contract of Harper's Bazaar. He supplied the fashion magazine with illustrations of fashion shown in Paris, London, and Rome. Max Hoff, an alias of Maximilian J. A. Hofbauer, was an illustrator famous especially for his advertisements for Simpsons of Piccadilly and Astor cigarettes. His art was perfectly representing the fashion of the 1950s and 1960s in Western Europe and North America. He was born in Vienna, Austria. Hoff studied portrait and landscape painting at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, where he had begun to make a name for himself through his stage and costume illustrations. A number of his fashion designs had been published under the alias Max Hoff in the European journal International Textiles, where Alex Simpson, the owner of Simpsons of Piccadilly, saw them. In 1936, Alex Simpson brought Hoff at the age of 33 to London and commissioned him to produce a series of illustrations of handsome, virile sporting men wearing Simpson clothes that were to become the representation of Simpson style for a quarter of a century. Soon, Simpson Piccadilly added women's clothes to its stock by fashionable, elegant, and charming women. First used in the direct mail brochures, Hoff's illustrations soon became the mainstay of Simpson advertising. Bill Crawford, the advertising agent of Simpsons, recognized the power of this imagery, and when Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, Crawford persuaded Max Hoff to move to London, where he married Margaret Popper in December of the same year and where his two children were born. His drawings of groups of impeccably dressed and social male figures, virtually always depicted in a smiling and relaxed attitude, became the signature style of Simpsons and Dax menswear press advertising right up until the early 1960s. Already at the end of the 1950s, Hoff started to work with the German advertisement agency Hans W. Bros. GmbH and its enigmatic owner Hans Walter Bros. In Frankfurt am Main. In 1958, a small campaign of only 8 ads due to a limited budget of Bomi Fechimi GmbH, his illustrations were advertising Feva Feinwaschmittel, fine washing powder. The work with Bros was going very well, and Simpsons decided to rebrand their advertisement. Hoff finished his work with Simpsons and from 1961 onwards became an exclusive advertisement artist for the Hans W. Bros. This happened due to the fact that Hans W. Bros, who had an advertising contract for Reemtsma's Aster cigarettes for some years, wanted to acquire a second contract with another cigarette trademark of Reemtsma, Haus Nuremberg. Therefore, in 1956, he agreed with Philip F. Reemtsma to transfer the Aster contract to his branch office in Habsburg, managed by Bros's son Heinz Martin. In 1961, Heinz Martin Bros decided to provide a new style for their ad campaign for Aster cigarettes. So he started Hoff's most famous campaign called Rendezvous der Prominenz, which ran until 1967. It was directed first at the German and then at the International High Society. Max Hoff has provided over 200 pictures for this series. After the opening of the Simpson Piccadilly store and after launching the Dax brand, Alexander Simpson needed to create a new advertising campaign to promote Dax and entice new customers. A fan of the excellent work and techniques of illustrator Max Hoff, Alexander met with Hoff in the 1930s and commissioned him to work on a series of illustrations for Dax from the early 1940s. These later became the signature style of Simpson's Piccadilly and Dax menswear. The colorful illustrations successfully captured the elegance and charisma of the Dax man, always showing impeccably dressed male figures in a smiling and relaxed attitude, and with the introduction of women's wear into the Dax brand, this included a fashionable, elegant and charming woman. These iconic illustrations were first used in the direct mail brochures and went on to be featured in all Dax advertising until the mid 1960s. Paul Henri-Bernegare was born in Angoulême, France in 1883. Of Basque parentage, Henri received his education in Paris from 1908 to 1910. He studied at the École des Beaux-Arts and the Collège Rollin. At age 17, Henri provided illustrations for the popular La Assiette au Beurre and also contributed drawings and caricatures for French satirical papers such as Le Rire, Sourire, Le Assiette au Beurre and La Baïonnette. His reputation grew, and it was said no one could sketch an event more tellingly. He was one of a talented group of like illustrators, including George Barbier, George Lipape, George Martin, and Pierre Brissot. Their modernist style, informed by both the vitality of the revolutionary art movements of the era and by the flat planes and minimalism identified with Japanese painting, served to revitalize the popularity of the fashion plate. These fashion plates were hand colored using the Pockire process, whereby stencils and metal plates are used, allowing for colors to be built up and gradually nuanced according to the artist's vision. An advertising tool, a piece of artwork used to create desire for the newest clothing, looks aimed at an audience of the fashionable and moneyed. Henri's work is primarily distinguished by the illustrations he executed for style journals such as La Gazette du Bon Ton, where his charming vignettes of the latest modes helped promote the designs of couturiers such as Paul Poiret. The appeal of these illustrations lay in their depiction of stylish women pursuing the everyday activities of an affluent lifestyle. Iree's design career was a prolific one, contributing text and visuals to Vogue magazine, designing fabrics, furniture, rugs, and doing interior design work for wealthy clients. Iree favored the liberal display of fluid forms more in accordance with the design elements which were the hallmark of the Art Nouveau movement. Puffs, lamy textiles, walls hung with tapestries, and carpeted floors. He was hostile to the new school of industrial design and provided his own terse critique of the Art Deco exposition of 1925, the alliance between art and the cube. In 1933, Iree collaborated with Coco Chanel in the design of extravagant jewelry pieces commissioned by the International Guild of Diamond Merchants. The collection, executed exclusively in diamonds and platinum, was exhibited for public viewing and drew a large audience. About 3,000 attendees were recorded in a 1-month period. The couture Paul Pirot recognized Iree's talent and brought him into creative drawings, which would compellingly represent the new models in this collection. These illustrations were later compiled into an album, Les Robes de Paul Pirot, Raconte par Paul Iree, published in 1908. The book created a controversy as Pirot's design aesthetic promoted clothing with a relaxed line, emphatically denouncing the corseted look so long in vogue as the mandated female silhouette. Iree's album discussed mothers. Contentious opinion, however, fueled a public debate, providing Pirot with the publicity that ultimately brought him success. Pirot's success also proved a triumph for Iree. In 1919, Iree was in Hollywood, recruit D for design work by film director Cecil B. DeMille. Iree and DeMille were ideally paired collaborators sharing a penchant for luxury replete with all the entailing visual drama. DeMille allowed Iree complete creative freedom. In Hollywood, Iree practiced the same design sensibilities for which he was renowned in Paris. His depiction of Egypt for DeMille's 1923, The Ten Commandments, was not a biblical rendition but pure Hollywood fantasy, all lacquered glamour and opulence. In 1924, Iree was given free rein in a film project for which he was director, set designer, and costumer, Changing Husbands, starring Beatrice Joy. The character of the male protagonist represented Iree himself, the novice director having reconstituted his own image for the screen. The film proved to be a critical disaster. The New York Times gave it a scathing review, calling the film absurd and the direction amateurish. Iree was a man prone to anger, shouting matches, and fistfights when contradicted, and did not endear himself to colleagues. He engaged in a sustained feud with DeMille's key costume designer Michel Leeson, which resulted in Leeson being fired by DeMille in 1923 after Iree's costly and infamous failure with Changing Husbands. DeMille was forced to make peace with Leeson and bring him back in for his film King of Kings. DeMille assigned Leeson as head designer. Now working with Leeson, Iree made a serious design error for one of the sets and DeMille let him go. Iree left Hollywood without any hope of returning there. Back in Paris, a consolation prize awaited Iree. His wife Mabel gave him his own design establishment dedicated to the decorative arts located on the fashionable Rue du Faubourg Saint-Honor. The first incarnation of Irif's journal, Le Témoin, The Witness, was published from 1906 to 1910. It was a compendium of social and political satire with artwork by Irib and contributions by other well-known illustrators of the day. Broadcasting a demonstrable French nationalism, the major illustrations in Le Témoin were always executed in three colors: the blue, white, and red of the French flag. The back cover was invariably an advertisement for French commerce, boosterism for French-made goods and industry. Signing his work Jim, a caricature drawn by the then unknown Jean Cocteau, was published in Le Témoin in 1910. His likeness of actress Sarah Bernhardt was well received and brought him instant recognition. Paul Irib divided the time till his death in 1935 between contributing satirical illustrations to the weekly political paper Le Témoin and designing jewelry for Channel. He died in 1935 at the age of 52. Kenneth Paul Bloch was one of the foremost fashion illustrators of the 20th century. For nearly 40 years, he was an in-house artist for Fairchild Publications, owner of Women's Wear Daily, the garment industry trade paper, and its offshoot W. As chief features artist, he helped transform the once dowdy WWD into the Bible of the jet set during the 1960s and 1970s. Babe Paley, Gloria Vanderbilt, Jacqueline D. Ribes, Amanda Burden, the Duchess of Windsor, and Gloria Guinness were among the society women who posed for him. Bloch's incisive yet graceful brushstrokes captured the most important styles of the post-war era, including collections by Norman Norell, Wes Saint Laurent, Pierre Cardin, Coco Chanel, James Galanos, Givenchy, Pauline Triggery, Bill Blass, Halston, and Geoffrey Bean.